Hello, and welcome to Forgotten Women of History, where I tell the stories of extraordinary women that most history books left behind. Everything here is carefully researched, and if you're listening in bed tonight, good. Let my voice be the kind thing you hear before sleep. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and leave a like if these stories mean something to you. It genuinely helps more people find them. Now, get comfortable, settle in, because tonight's story is one of the most remarkable I've ever told, and I don't say that lightly. Close your eyes if you'd like. Let's go to Moscow. The year is 1547. The city is on fire. On June 21, 1547, Moscow had been burning for the third day in a row. The flames, which had erupted at the Arbat Gate, one of the city's main entrances, devoured the wooden structures with such ferocity that it seemed as if hell itself had descended to earth. It is important to understand here that medieval Moscow was almost entirely made of wood. Unlike the stone cities of Western Europe, the Russians built with wood, quickly, cheaply, and as they were accustomed to. This made the city warm and cozy in winter, but deadly vulnerable in summer. Fires were not a rarity, but a regular calamity, part of the very rhythm of city life. The wind carried sparks over the Kremlin walls. Smoke obscured the sun, turning day into twilight. People rushed through the streets, saving their belongings, their simple household possessions, chests of clothes, icons, children, and the elderly. Some prayed, others cursed the heavens, and in the Kremlin, behind the thick walls of the Cathedral of the Annunciation, the 17-year-old Tsar Ivan Vasilievich stood at the window and watched this apocalypse, powerless to change anything. Before moving on, it's worth saying a few words about who this young man was and why his story is important for understanding Russian history as a whole. In the West, Ivan IV is known as Ivan the Terrible, but the English word terrible, meaning horrible or frightening, does not quite capture the Russian word grozny. In Russian, this word primarily meant a thunderstorm, that is, a force that inspires awe, like a thundercloud, both frightening and cleansing. The closest English equivalent is likely inspiring a sacred dread. However, history has vindicated even the darkest interpretation of this nickname. Ivan IV went down in history as one of the most brutal rulers Europe has ever known. He executed thousands of people, wiped out entire families, personally participated in torture, and created a secret police force, the oprichnina, which turned the country into a reign of terror. But in June 1547, that nightmare was still a long way off. Before us stands a frightened teenager, crowned just 5 months earlier. On January 16, 1547, the coronation that changed everything took place in the Assumption Cathedral of the Moscow Kremlin. Ivan Vasilievich became the first ruler in the history of Rus to adopt the title of Tsar, from the Latin Caesar. Before him, Moscow's rulers were known as Grand Princes. The new title was a deliberate political statement. Moscow claimed the role of heir to the fallen Byzantine Empire, the Third Rome. Monomach's crown, according to legend, sent by the Byzantine Emperor Constantine Monomach to Prince Vladimir of Kiev, was placed upon his head by Metropolitan Makary amid the sounds of solemn prayers. For an Orthodox Christian of that era, this was not merely a political ceremony, but a sacred act. The Tsar became God's anointed one, his representative on earth. The solemn ceremony was meant to mark the beginning of a new era. But reality turned out to be far more brutal. The young Tsar inherited not simply a state, but chaos. 20 years of boyar rule during his minority had turned the country into an arena of ceaseless intrigue. Here it is necessary to explain what boyars are. For English-speaking readers, the closest analogy is a powerful feudal aristocracy, something halfway between the English barons of the Magna Carta era and the Italian condottieri. The boyars were a hereditary nobility who owned vast tracts of land, estates, and maintained their own private armies. Unlike Western European aristocrats who were bound by feudal obligations, Russian boyars possessed the right of departure. They could switch their allegiance from one prince to another. While Ivan was growing up, the boyar clans fought among themselves for power with wolfish ferocity, stopping at nothing. It was the people who took to the streets during that terrible June. Thousands of Muscovites who had lost their homes in the fire were searching for those responsible, and they found them, or were led to them. The Glinskys, the Tsar's mother's family, had held power in their hands for years. Rumors circulated that Princess Anna Glinskaya had set Moscow ablaze through witchcraft, that she ripped out people's hearts, soaked them in water, and sprinkled the streets with it, summoning the fire. Utter nonsense. But when thousands of people are left homeless, they need a flesh and blood enemy, not a faceless force of nature. An uprising was inevitable. The mob stormed the cathedral of the Dormition, seized the Tsar's uncle, Yuri Glinsky, right at the altar, and tore him to pieces on the steps. Blood on the stones of the ancient cathedral. That was the first message the young autocrat received. Your power is illusory. The Tsar fled from Moscow to the village of Vorobayovo, a small country residence on a hill above the Moskva River, and there, looking out at the smoldering ruins of the capital, he realized the most important thing: he was completely alone. Ivan's loneliness was not merely an emotional state, it was a political reality. Boyar clans swirled around him, each with its own ambitions: the Shuiskys, the Belskys, and others. All saw the young Tsar as either a puppet or an obstacle. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, died when he was 8 years old, rumored to have been poisoned. His childhood was spent in an atmosphere of constant fear, humiliation, and betrayal. The country needed a firm hand. In Kazan, a hostile khanate was gaining strength, threatening the eastern borders. In the west, Lithuania and Livonia viewed Rus as a tempting prize. Anarchy reigned within the state. Every boyar was a little Tsar in his own fiefdom, doing as he pleased. Reforms, an army, and a new system of government were needed. But all of this required time and inner peace, and Ivan had neither. His soul was torn on the one hand, a thirst for greatness, a desire to prove himself worthy of his ancestors; on the other, mistrust, anger, and the fear of being betrayed and humiliated once again. The young Tsar needed an anchor, a person who would keep him from plunging into the abyss of rage, who would give him what he had been deprived of his entire life: unconditional love and trust. And fate, as if hearing this silent cry of despair, was already preparing an answer. In February 1547, even before the Moscow fire and the uprising, 1,500 young women were brought to the capital from all over the country. Among them was one whose name would go down in history as a symbol of unfulfilled hope: Anastasia Romanovna Tsarina Yurieva. Imagine the scale of the event. This was no ordinary matchmaking to which the European nobility had grown accustomed, where marriages were arranged through correspondence between courts, and the bride and groom sometimes saw each other for the first time at the altar. The young Tsar decided to revive an ancient Byzantine tradition known in Russia as the bride selection, letters were sent out to every city and village throughout the vast empire. The most beautiful, healthy, and virtuous young women were to be brought to the capital. Local officials, the governors, personally toured the lands under their jurisdiction, and no father, whether a boyar or a provincial nobleman, could refuse. Boyars and nobles brought their daughters to the Kremlin, hoping to draw a lucky ticket in the lottery of fate. As a result, an unimaginable number of candidates arrived. This procedure was not a whim of the young monarch, but a carefully calculated political move. Ivan categorically rejected the idea of a dynastic marriage to a foreign princess. He did not want a woman of a different faith by his side and did not wish to have foreign customs in his home. But even more than that, he feared taking a wife from the powerful Russian princely families. Marrying a member of the Shuisky-Belsky or Mstislavsky families would have inevitably strengthened one faction and offended all the others. This would only have added fuel to the fire of boyar strife. The Tsar needed a wife who would belong solely to him. The review of prospective brides turned into a brutal selection process, resembling a medical examination more than a beauty pageant. The young women were housed in specially designated chambers where they were watched day and night. They were examined by physicians and midwives. The future Tsarina had to be in perfect health so she could bear strong hairs and be of impeccable chastity. Any physical flaw could result in immediate dismissal. From 1,500, several hundred were selected, then several dozen. Finally, 12 finalists appeared before Ivan. The 17-year-old Tsar's gaze did not rest on the wealthiest or the most noble candidate. His chosen one was Anastasia Romanovna. Contemporaries and descendants have wondered for centuries what exactly attracted Ivan to this quiet young woman. Modern studies of her remains have shown that she was of short stature, but possessed regular, delicate facial features and luxurious long hair. In Muscovite Russia, a long braid was considered the primary sign of feminine beauty. Unmarried girls wore a single braid, while married women tucked their hair under a headdress, and loose hair was a sign of maidenhood. However, it was not just a matter of appearance. In her eyes, Ivan saw what he had so sorely lacked in court life: gentleness, humility, and a deep, sincere piety. Anastasia came from an ancient, though not princely, family. The Zakharin Yuryevs were native Muscovite boyars who had served the grand princes for centuries, but did not have the blood of the Rurikids running through their veins. The legendary dynasty founded, according to legend, by the Varangian chieftain Rorik in the 9th century, and which ruled Rus for 7 centuries. They were servants, not rulers, and this nuance was of colossal importance to the suspicious Ivan. Anastasia's relatives had not participated in the bloody power struggles of the boyars' turbulent era. They had stayed out of the struggle for power. By choosing Anastasia, the Tsar was elevating from obscurity a family that would owe its rise to him personally and to no one else. There was another, more personal reason. Anastasia was an orphan. Her father, Roman Yuryevich, had died when she was very young. Ivan, who himself had lost his father at an early age and had been virtually deprived of his mother's affection, subconsciously gravitated towards someone with a similar fate, but with a completely different inner world. If Ivan's orphanhood had embittered him, filling his heart with suspicion, Anastasia's orphanhood had made her sensitive to the pain of others. She grew up in the terem, the women's quarters of the house, separated from the men's. in an atmosphere of prayer and needlework, far from intrigue. In Russian culture, the terem was not a prison, but a special space belonging to the world of women. Noble women in Muscovite Russia led a semi-reclusive life. They did not attend public feasts, did not receive outside men, and rarely left the confines of their estate. This practice was borrowed partly from Byzantium and partly from Tatar culture during the era of Mongol rule. Such isolation was perceived not as oppression, but as a sign of high status. The more noble the family, the more strictly this tradition was observed. Commoners' wives worked in the fields side by side with their husbands, while the daughters of the boyars lived behind painted latticework. Anastasia grew up in precisely such a world, quiet, devout, and far removed from political turmoil. The Tsar's choice caused shock and quiet resentment among the highest ranks of the aristocracy, the proud princes of the Rurikids and Gediminids, descendants of the Lithuanian Grand Ducal Dynasty, which was no less ancient than the Rurikids, considered it an insult that the sovereign had chosen a low-born maiden from a family of service boyars over them. Malicious tongues whispered that the Zakharins had bewitched the Tsar and that this marriage would bring no happiness. But Ivan was unyielding. On February 3, 1547, Metropolitan Makary married the couple in the Assumption Cathedral of the Kremlin. It was the first wedding of a Russian Tsar, and it became a declaration of the monarch's independence from the will of the boyars. To grasp the magnitude of what this fragile woman accomplished, one must clearly picture exactly with whom she shared her life. At the beginning of their marriage, Ivan Vassilievich was far from the wise statesman depicted in his official portraits. He was a young man with a shattered psyche. Before his marriage, his favorite pastimes were cruel games. He would throw dogs and cats off the Kremlin towers, reveling in their suffering, and, together with a gang of boyars' children, young nobles from his retinue, he would gallop through Moscow's market streets, trampling stalls with his horses and beating up passers-by. An unbridled, destructive energy raged within him, seeking an outlet in violence. He was a volcano, ready at any moment to spew a torrent of rage at anyone who crossed his path, a servant, a boyar, or a random passerby. And then, into the world of this unbridled man, a quiet, modest young woman entered, armed only with gentleness and patience. The first years of their life together became a true psychological miracle. Anastasia did not try to change her husband with lectures and reproaches. That would have provoked only a new outburst of rage in the proud Ivan. She acted differently, intuitively finding the only true path to the heart of a traumatized man. The Tsarina created a space of almost sacred tranquility around herself. When Ivan, agitated after arguments with the boyars, burst into her chambers, he found himself in another world. Here there were no shouts or intrigues, no trace of that clinging fear that had haunted him since the cradle. The air was filled with the scent of incense and wax, a scent inseparable from orthodox worship and private prayer. Oil lamps flickered before the icons, and the quiet voice of his wife, reading psalms or engaged in needlework, had the most powerful calming effect on him. The lamp before the icon, a small oil lamp that burned in every Orthodox home before the images, icons depicting saints. It was a living flame of prayer, a symbol of God's presence in the home. For a Western reader, the closest analogy would be a candle before a crucifix in a Catholic home, but in the Russian tradition, the lamp burned constantly, creating a special atmosphere of quiet sacredness. Historians traditionally attribute the changes in the young Tsar's character to the influence of Archpriest Sylvester and Alexei Adashev, leaders of the so-called Chosen Council, a circle of advisors surrounding the throne. The Chosen Council was the unofficial name given to this government circle, later coined by Kurbsky. In Russian, Rada means council. These men played a colossal role in Ivan's political education, instilling in him the idea of a monarch's responsibility before God. But no sermons by the stern priest Sylvester would have achieved their goal if Anastasia had not prepared the ground for them. It was she who extinguished the inner fire that was consuming the Tsar from within. Sylvester threatened him with the torments of hell for his sins, while Anastasia offered hope for forgiveness through love and family happiness. The changes affected the very way of life at the Moscow court. Noisy, drunken feasts with skomorok dances gradually became a thing of the past. Skomoroki, wandering performers, a cross between medieval jugglers and folk comedians, had been an integral part of Russian feasts. The Orthodox Church viewed them with suspicion, considering them servants of the devil. They were replaced by long church services and pilgrimages to monasteries. Anastasia possessed a natural intellect and quickly grasped the essence of state affairs, but she never imposed her opinion, offering advice so gently that it seemed to the Tsar as if these were his own thoughts. She masterfully allayed his suspicion, convincing him that not everyone around him was an enemy and that the Tsar's mercy was the best defense of his power. The most striking evidence of her beneficial influence was the statistics on executions. During her marriage to Anastasia, a period historians rightly call a golden age, disgrace and executions were exceptionally rare. Even when conflicts with the boyars arose, they ended not with the execution block but with exile. Anastasia drew upon the special role traditionally assigned to Russian Tsarinas, that of the intercessor. She personally pleaded with the Tsar for the forgiveness of the condemned, and Ivan, the future architect of the most sophisticated tortures, listened to her. He would revoke orders and replace anger with mercy, as if afraid of upsetting the woman he loved, whose tears frightened him more than any boyar conspiracy. The bond between the spouses grew stronger through shared sorrow and shared joy. Their children, their first two children, daughters Anna and Maria, died in infancy. This shared sorrow did not drive them apart, but brought them even closer together. When Tsarevich Dmitry was finally born, and then in 1554 Tsarevich Ivan, the very one who, years later, would meet his end at his father's hand, Ivan's happiness knew no bounds. He felt like a fulfilled man, the founder of a great dynasty, a man to whom God had not withheld his grace. His mental state during those years was as stable as it could be, and this happiness made him a wise and just ruler. However, the idyll of those early years was merely a lull. Clouds were already gathering beyond the walls of the Tsar's bedchamber. The 1550s in Russian history are often referred to as the Golden Decade. The state apparatus, which had previously creaked and faltered, suddenly began to function with incredible efficiency. Large-scale reforms were carried out. The 1550 Sudebnik codified the law. The Streltsy army was formed, Russia's first regular professional army armed with firearms. Previously, troops had been assembled as needed from the noble militia. The Streltsy, however, served on a permanent basis, received a salary, and lived in special settlements. The practice of mesnichestvo, a unique Russian system in which the right to hold a particular post was determined not by talent, but by noble birth, was curtailed. A noble but untalented boyar would receive a higher position than an intelligent but low-born person. The abolition of this principle made it possible to promote people based on their abilities. But the greatest triumph was in foreign policy. The fall of Kazan in October 1552 was an event that people in Russia compared to a crusade. The Khanate of Kazan, a remnant of the Golden Horde, the Mongol Empire that had kept Russia in vassalage for 2.5 centuries, had for centuries carried out devastating raids on Russian lands, taking people into slavery. For Western readers, this was roughly the equivalent of the Reconquista for Spain, only condensed into a single great campaign. The capture of Kazan closed this chapter of centuries-long humiliation. The annexation of Astrakhan in 1556 made the Volga, the great Russian river and a major trade artery, entirely Russian from source to mouth. Trade routes to the east were now open, but behind the Fas, aid of these achievements stood a quiet, unassuming figure, without whom none of this would have been possible, Anastasia Romanovna. While Ivan laid siege to the walls of Kazan, she waged her own, no less important war, a war for the spiritual well-being of her husband and her country. She turned her chambers into a center of charity. She generously distributed alms to the poor and the disabled, praying for the victory of the Russian army. But her activities were not limited to prayer. Anastasia headed a workshop for icon embroidery, the Svetlitsa. It was a true artistic center here, under the Tsarina's guidance. Magnificent shrouds, coverings, and processional banners, liturgical standards were created for churches and monasteries. Facial embroidery, the embroidery of saints' faces with silk, gold and silver threads, and pearls, was an art of the highest order in Muscovite Rus, comparable to icon painting. For Western readers, it was roughly the equivalent of tapestry making in France, only with profound religious significance. In the medieval mindset, such gifts to the church held sacred significance. They were offerings to God for the success of state affairs. The banners embroidered with gold and pearls that Ivan's regiments carried to Kazan were often the handiwork of his wife and her craftswomen. It was precisely at this time that Anastasia, perhaps for the first time in her life, allowed herself to display not only meekness, but also strength of character. When, in 1550, the Tsar fell gravely ill, the chronicles describe his condition as a severe fever accompanied by loss of consciousness, and his advisors began discussing the question of succession even before his death. It was Anastasia who did not leave her husband's bedside for a single moment. She saw how the boyars, whom Ivan had ordered to swear allegiance to the newborn Tsarevich Dmitry, began to waver, glancing at the Tsar's cousin, the adult and independent Vladimir Andreevich Staretsky. Adashev's father defiantly declared to the dying Tsar, "We'll kiss the cross for you and your son, but we will not serve the Zakharins." This was an open insult. The boyars were making it clear that they did not wish to see the Tsarina's relatives as regents. In those days, the gentle dove turned into a tigress defending her offspring. She understood perfectly well. If Ivan died and Staretsky ascended the throne, she and little Dmitry would be immediately eliminated as rivals, killed or confined to a convent. Ivan survived, but the man who rose from that deathbed was a different person, with a crack in his soul that time only widened. However, as long as Anastasia was by his side, the system held together. An ideal trio had formed: Ivan, the sword and the will, the chosen counsel; the intellect and the law, Anastasia, the soul and the conscience; the Tsar's advisors, though they disliked the Zakharins, were forced to admit that with her by his side, the sovereign was capable of working and of sound mind. She did not interfere with their governance of the country. She created the conditions in which governance was possible at all. Without her calming presence, Ivan could have lost control at any moment, destroying everything they had built. Therefore, even the most ambitious boyars tolerated the Zakharin's rise to power, realizing that a bad peace was better than a good quarrel with the Tsar. However, this golden age was fragile. It depended on the life of a single woman. Historians often describe the period following the Tsar's illness as a time of strange dual power. But this was not political dual power in the usual sense, where two parties share portfolios. It was a battle for the soul of a single man. The Kremlin chambers became the battlefield of an invisible yet deadly struggle, where the weapons were not sabers but hints, glances, heavy sighs and whispers. On one side stood the chosen council, led by the stern spiritual advisor Sylvester and the brilliant administrator Adashev. On the other, a lonely woman whose only strength lay in the fact that the Tsar fell asleep and woke up in her arms. The conflict had deep ideological roots. Sylvester was the editor and chief propagandist of Evdomostroy, a code of rules governing life in a Russian Orthodox household for Western readers. Domostroy is something of a cross between Isabella Beeton's English book of household management and a medieval catechism, only written from the perspective of strict patriarchal authority. According to these rules, a wife was to obey her husband unquestioningly, while a husband was to instruct her in the fear of God. Sylvester extended this view of the family to the state. The Tsar was to be strict and his wife invisible. Anastasia's influence on politics, however indirect, was for him a violation of the very divine order. His advisors pressed on Ivan's most sensitive spot, his male pride. "Sovereign, you listen to a woman rather than to wise men," they whispered surreptitiously. "This is unworthy of a great monarch." They reproached him for his excessive attachment to his family, hinting that a true ruler must rise above personal feelings. The Tsarina's brothers, the Zakharins, aroused particular fury. Andrei Kurbsky, the Tsar's closest confidant and, in the future, his most notorious traitor, the only Russian boyar to flee abroad, and from there openly denounced the Tsar in letters, called them flatterers, that is, sycophants who were allegedly corrupting the sovereign. This was a lie. The Zakharins behaved with surprising modesty compared to previous favorites. But in political struggle, facts matter less than repeated accusations. Anastasia saw through this web. She was gentle, but not naive. She understood Sylvester and Adashev were trying to erect a wall between her and her husband. The Tsarina sensed how Ivan's face would darken after consulting with them, how his gaze would harden at the mention of her family. She had to display remarkable self-control to avoid slipping into open hysteria, to refrain from demanding the heads of her enemies. That would have been exactly what was expected of her, proof of foolish, womanish temperament. Instead, she continued to create in her private chambers the contrast that was her only weapon. There, demands, politics, the cold calculation of her advisors. Here, love, acceptance, and peace. But the tension was mounting and eating away at her from the inside. Anastasia gave birth 6 times. Of her 6 children, only 2 sons survived. Constant stress, the grief of losing children, and the oppressive atmosphere of hatred and fear, all of this was undermining her health. By the end of the 1550s, Doctors had likely already noticed that the Tsarina was unwell. Her enemies, like predators sensing the scent of blood, only intensified the pressure. No one knew that the end was very near. However, this golden age was fragile. It depended on the life of a single woman. The year was 1560. It was an ominous summer. Moscow was suffocating from the heat and smoke. The city was burning once again. The wind carried black ash over the Kremlin like flakes of morning. In this stifling atmosphere, the life of the woman who was the heart of the state was fading away. Tsarina Anastasia had taken to her bed. Until recently a woman in her prime, not yet 30 years old, she was wasting away before everyone's eyes. Officially, they spoke of illness, but at court, people whispered about something else. This ailment was far too sudden and strange. Ivan was in a panic, fearing that the smoke-filled air of Moscow was killing his wife. He decided to move Anastasia to a country residence, the village of Kolomenskoye, a picturesque estate on the high bank of the Moskva River, about 10 kilometers from the Kremlin. Today it is a city park within Moscow's boundaries, where the magnificent 16th century Church of the Ascension, a gem of Russian tent-roofed architecture, has been preserved. Ivan built it in 1532 to commemorate his birth. It was here that he brought his dying wife. The Tsar's train moved slowly, taking care not to disturb the sick woman. Ivan hoped that the fresh air, the silence, and the absence of the Kremlin's toxic atmosphere would help his beloved recover. No miracle occurred. Her illness progressed rapidly and irreversibly. Anastasia hardly ever got out of bed. Her beautiful face had grown gaunt. Her eyes, which had once shone with gentleness, were now full of anguish and a feverish gleam. Ivan never left her bedside. The chroniclers, emotionally reserved historians, who, as a rule, wrote in dry, bureaucratic language, have left us striking accounts. The Tsar, the formidable autocrat before whom all of Europe trembled, wept like a child. For hours he sat at his wife's bedside, holding her emaciated hand, trying to catch her gaze. In those moments, his world was crumbling because he understood the only person who loved him selflessly was leaving, the only one who was his connection to reality, to God, to himself. The Tsar's entourage kept a low profile during those days. Adashev and Sylvester tried to avoid catching his eye. They sensed that if the Tsarina died, they would be blamed, not necessarily for murder, but for having driven her to her end with their intrigues. They were not mistaken. Ivan, watching his wife's suffering, became increasingly convinced of one thing. They've destroyed my dove. This isn't an illness, it's human malice. This thought pulsed through his mind, turning grief into rage. He recalled every sidelong glance, every harsh word spoken by his advisors toward Anastasia. It all added up to a picture of a conspiracy. On August 7, 1560, Anastasia Romanovna's heart stopped beating. She was about 28 years old. The silence that fell over the chambers of Kolomna after her last breath was more terrifying than any scream. The chronicle states, the Tsar, overcome by great wailing and deep grief, was barely in his right mind. This old Russian expression describes a state bordering on insanity. They literally had to pull him away from his wife's body. The funeral took place at the Ascension Monastery in the Kremlin, the burial place of Moscow's Grand Duchesses and Tsarinas. This monastery was destroyed under Soviet rule in 1929. The remains of the women buried there, including Anastasia's, were transferred to the crypt of the Archangel Cathedral, where they remain to this day. A huge crowd followed the coffin. The people sincerely loved their kind Tsarina. The beggars she had helped fell to their knees. But Ivan did not see the crowd. Supported by the arms of the deceased's brothers, he walked with a face like the mask of death. That day, he was not merely burying his wife. He was burying his youth, his faith in people, and his hope for happiness. He was burying that kind Tsar Ivan, the man he had been for 13 years by her side. At the wake, the boyars could not hide their relief. For the war faction, for all who hated the Zakharins, Anastasia's death was a political gift. They believed that now, freed from a woman's influence, the Tsar would finally become manageable. They made the most terrible mistake of their lives. For 4.5 centuries, the theory that Anastasia had been poisoned remained just that, a theory, a terrifying legend born of the Tsar's fevered imagination. Skeptics argued Ivan the Terrible was a paranoid man who saw conspiracies everywhere. Young women in the Middle Ages often died from childbed fever, infections, or simply from exhaustion. It seemed that the mystery of the first Russian, Tsarina's death, was buried forever beneath the heavy slabs of the Kremlin cathedrals. But science knows how to speak with the dead. In the 2000s, a group of Russian scientists led by Tatyana Dmitrievna Panova, the chief archaeologist of the Moscow Kremlin, conducted a large-scale study of the remains of medieval Tsarina stored in the crypt of the Archangel Cathedral. When the experts opened Anastasia Romanovna's sarcophagus, they found a skeleton and a thick braid of reddish, blonde hair that was remarkably well preserved, the very same hair that the young Ivan had once admired. It was this hair that became the key piece of physical evidence in the case, which was reopened 440 years after the crime. Scientists used X-ray fluorescence spectral analysis, a technology that allows for the determination of a tissue's chemical composition with the highest precision. For the layperson, this method works much like an X-ray, except that instead of an image, it provides a chemical signature of the substance. Hair is particularly valuable to toxicologists. It accumulates traces of heavy metals that entered the body over many months, and its composition can be used to reconstruct the history of poisoning with accuracy down to the week. The results stunned the researchers. A concentration of mercury exceeding the natural background level by a factor of 10, 4.8 mmg per 100 joule, was detected in Anastasia's braid. By comparison, for Grand Duchess Sofia Paleologina, the grandmother of Ivan III and great-grandmother of Ivan the Terrible, who lived several decades earlier, this figure was 15 times lower. In addition to mercury, the analysis revealed off the charts levels of arsenic and lead. Skeptics immediately countered with the argument that cosmetics and medicines in the 16th century were downright toxic. This is no exaggeration. Medieval European aristocratic women used lead white to achieve a pale complexion and rouge made from cinnabar, mercury sulfide. Mercury-based preparations were used to treat skin diseases and syphilis. Poisoning oneself for the sake of beauty was literally a real phenomenon of the era. Scientists tested this hypothesis. They examined the remains of Ivan the Terrible's other wives, Maria Temryukovna and Marfa Sebekina, as well as those of other noblewomen of the time. Traces of heavy metals were found in many of them, but in no one else were they found in such high concentrations. Moreover, the condition of Anastasia's bones did not indicate a chronic, long-term accumulation of poison, as would be the case with cosmetics used over many years. The evidence pointed to an acute, massive influx of toxins into her body shortly before her death. Another discovery proved decisive. Researchers compared the composition of the remains with preserved fragments of the queen's burial garment, her shroud. Spectral analysis of the fabric showed no elevated levels of toxins. This completely refuted the theory of external contamination. If mercury had been used during embalming or burial, it would have permeated the fabric as well. But the fabric was clean. The poison was inside her, in her hair, in her bones. This meant only one thing: Anastasia had been poisoned while alive through food or drink and had received lethal doses: mercury, arsenic, and lead, the classic trio of poisons from the Renaissance era. This cocktail was used at courts throughout Europe, from the Borgias in Rome to the Medici in Florence. This combination of poisons destroyed the kidneys, liver, and nervous system, causing symptoms similar to a severe illness. The victim's life faded away slowly and painfully, which is exactly what everyone around Anastasia witnessed during the final months of her life. It was the perfect murder for an era that knew nothing of toxicological analysis. An important caveat that many popular retellings of this story overlook: the scientific community has still not reached a unanimous conclusion. A number of toxicologists point out that mercury compounds were actively used precisely to treat the symptoms Anastasia exhibited, and the high concentration could have been the result of intensive treatment. In other words, she may not have been poisoned, but rather treated, and treated to death, which was common practice in the medicine of that time. However, most researchers, considering the body of evidence, especially the absence of poisons in her tissues and the acute nature of the poisoning, lean toward the theory of premeditated murder. One thing is certain: Ivan the Terrible's suspicions were not paranoid delusions. Who could it have been? Science does not name names, but the historical context points to an obvious logic. Killing the Tsar was too dangerous. The murder of his wife was a blow below the belt, a way to break a man, to make him controllable through grief, or, conversely, to provoke him into making mistakes that would destroy his reputation. The murder of Anastasia was likely the most effective political crime in Russian history. It achieved its goal and turned the country's history upside down. Anastasia's funeral divided Ivan IV's life into before and after so sharply as if an axe had struck him. That inner beast, which Anastasia had kept in check for 13 years with her love, broke free, and it was hungry. The chosen council became the first victim. Adashev and Sylvester were removed from power and sent into exile. Adashev died in captivity. Sylvester spent his final days in a monastery in the far north. The break with the advisors, who until recently had seemed irreplaceable, happened with stunning speed. Within a few months, nothing remained of the golden cabinet. But that was only the beginning. Ivan began to drink. The palace feasts, which had been marked by restraint under Anastasia, turned into orgies with a grim undertone. The Tsar tried to drown his pain in wine and debauchery. He went from woman to woman, but each new marriage only underscored the emptiness. He searched for Anastasia in each of them, and he did not find her. Here it is necessary to recount separately what happened to Ivan the Terrible's subsequent wives, because this story speaks for itself in a terrifying way. The Orthodox Church permitted a maximum of 3 marriages. For his 4th, 5th, and 6th marriages, Ivan was granted exemptions or simply ignored the Church's prohibitions. A comparison with Henry VIII of England, who became famous for his 6 marriages during the same decades, suggests itself. But the stories of Ivan the Terrible's wives are perhaps even more tragic. His first wife was Anastasia Romanovna Tsarina, Yurieva's 47-15-60, 13 years of happiness, 6 children, most of whom died in infancy. She was in all likelihood poisoned. His second wife was Maria Temryukovna, 1561-1569, a Circassian princess from the North Caucasus, the daughter of the Kabardian prince Temryk. The Circassians were a mountain people who had preserved their pagan traditions and had only recently converted to Islam. Bringing such a bride to Moscow and baptizing her into the Orthodox faith was a politically significant move, a demonstration of power over the Caucasus. Maria was passionate, headstrong, and completely unlike the meek Anastasia. The courtiers feared her temperament. It was said that she took pleasure in watching executions. Her relationship with the Tsar did not bring her happiness. She lived with Ivan for 8 years and died in 1569 under suspicious circumstances. An examination of her remains also revealed signs of poisoning. His third wife was Martha Sobekina, 1571. Her story is one of the most gruesome. Ivan chose her through a new round of bride selection. Right in the midst of the wedding celebrations, even before consummating the marriage, Martha began to rapidly waste away. She died 2 weeks after the wedding. According to canon law, a marriage that did not become a valid marriage was not considered to have taken place, which allowed Ivan to marry again without formally violating the rule limiting him to 3 marriages. The cause of death was cited as poisoning. Ivan was once again suspected, this time of having cast an evil eye on his bride himself. His fourth wife was Anna Koltovskaya's 1572, another round of prospective brides, another hope for happiness. Ivan lived with her for about a year, after which she was tonsured as a nun and confined to a convent where she spent more than 50 years. She outlived both her husband and his entire bloody reign. The monastery walls became for her both a prison and a refuge. Was Anna Vasilskova, circa 1774-1575. Very little is known about her. Even the date of the wedding has not been definitively established. She disappeared from historical sources just as suddenly as she had appeared. According to one account, she died. According to another, she was tonsured as a nun. His sixth wife was Vasilisa Melentieva, c. 1575-1577, the widow of an oprichnik. Historians still debate whether this marriage was official or if she was simply a concubine. She ended up, like many of her predecessors. The seventh wife was Maria Nagaya, 1580-1584, the last. She bore Ivan a son, Tsarevich Dmitry, who was destined to die in Uglitch in 1591 under mysterious circumstances, giving rise to a wave of impostors and triggering the time of troubles. After Ivan's death, Maria took the veil. The outcome of this chronicle is horrifying. Of the 7 wives, one was poisoned to death. One died under unexplained circumstances with signs of poisoning. One passed away 2 weeks after the wedding. 3 were forcibly tonsured as nuns, and one gave birth to a child who was later murdered. None of them gave Ivan what Anastasia had given him. None of them could get close to him the way she did. He searched for her again and again, and each time found only a reflection of his own loneliness. My body is exhausted. My spirit is sick. My wounds, both mental and physical, have multiplied, and there is no doctor who can heal me. Ivan wrote in one of his later letters. It was the cry of a man who had lost his only anchor. It was precisely in this state of mental disintegration that the plan for the oprichnina took shape in his mind, a phenomenon so distinctly Russian that it has no exact parallel in world history. Let us try to explain to the Western reader what this was. In 1565, Ivan divided the country into 2 parts. The Zemshchina was a conventional state governed by the Boyar Duma and traditional institutions. The oprichnina was the Tsar's personal domain, literally a separate fief. From the word oprik, meaning besides or separately, within the oprichnina, its own laws applied, or rather, there was only one law, the Tsar's will. The oprichniki, a special military force, wore black clothing and rode jet black horses, to whose saddles were tied a broom and a dog's head, symbols of their role in sweeping and gnawing treason out of the state. The oprichniki were exempt from the jurisdiction of ordinary courts. They could kill, plunder, and rape on the lands of the zemstvo with virtually complete impunity. This was not merely a political reform. It was the materialization of Ivan's trauma projected onto the country. He was creating new, loyal people, just as he had once had his loyal Anastasia, only this time the bond was based not on love, but on fear. In 1565, he staged another theatrical gesture that went down in history. He suddenly left Moscow and traveled to Alexandrovskaya Sloboda, a fortified country residence about 100 kilometers from the capital. From there, he sent a letter in which he abdicated the throne, accusing the boyars of treason. To understand the context, in Orthodox Russia at that time, the Tsar was God's anointed one. His abdication was perceived not as a political gesture, but almost as God having forsaken the country. A country without a Tsar was a country without God. The people were horrified. The boyars and the clergy begged Ivan on their knees to return. He returned, but he set a condition: the right to execute traitors without trial or investigation. The country agreed. The terror began. Historians disagree on the number of victims. According to various estimates, the oprichnina claimed anywhere from several thousand to tens of thousands of lives. Among those executed were the nation's leading figures, military commanders, diplomats, and church hierarchs. In 1570, the oprichniki razed Novgorod, the country's second largest city, with a history spanning 7 centuries. The mass killings lasted several weeks. According to some sources, between 3,000 and 15,000 people were killed. The great and free city of Novgorod never fully recovered from this blow. For a Western reader, the scale of what happened becomes clearer if one imagines that England's Henry V did not merely execute a few wives and disfavored advisors, but destroyed, for example, York or Edinburgh along with their populations on suspicion of disloyalty. In 1571, while the oprichnina was busy destroying its own people, the Crimean Khan Devlet Jire raided Moscow and burned it to the ground. For the first time in 200 years since Batu's invasion, the oprichnina, ostensibly created to protect the state from internal enemies, proved powerless against external enemies, because by that time it had already eliminated the country's finest military commanders. The circle had closed with cruel irony. Ivan had feared a fire over Moscow since he was 17, ever since that very June of 1547, when he stood at the window of the Cathedral of the Annunciation and watched the city burn. Back then, there was no one beside him. Then Anastasia appeared, and the fires ceased, at least the ones burning within him. When she left, the fire returned, and this time it burned everything to the ground. To truly understand what Anastasia meant to Ivan, one must look at what happened after she was gone. The Orthodox Church permitted a maximum of 3 marriages, and even that was considered an extreme concession to human weakness. A 4th marriage was canonically impossible. A 5th, 6th, or 7th, unthinkable, yet Ivan married 7 times. For Western readers, A parallel here with Henry VIII of England, who became famous for his 6 marriages during roughly the same decades, is apt. Both monarchs were contemporaries. Henry died in 1547, just as Ivan was ascending the throne. Both sought an heir and political support through marriage. But while Henry actively dissolved his marriages, executing his wives, declaring their marriages null and void, and even establishing an entirely new church for the sake of divorce, Ivan tended to lose his wives passively. They died, disappeared, or took the veil. Henry was a hunter. Ivan was a man whom happiness itself betrayed time and again. The story of Ivan the Terrible's 7 marriages is a chronicle of one endless disappointment. Of the 7 women who became Ivan the Terrible's wives, one was poisoned in the prime of her life. One died under suspicious circumstances with signs of poisoning. One passed away 2 weeks after the wedding. 3 were forcibly tonsured as nuns. One became the mother of a child whose death triggered a national catastrophe. None of them managed to get as close to Ivan as Anastasia did. None became his anchor. None could stop the destruction that took hold of him after August 1560. He searched for her again and again, in a Circassian princess, in a modest noblewoman, in a young widow, and each time he realized he was searching for something that was no longer there. That Anastasia was not merely a woman, she was a state of his soul that would never return. Ivan the Terrible's final years were just as bleak as his middle years, only without that energy of fury that had at least lent them a certain terrifying grandeur. By the early 1580s, the Tsar was physically broken. He was not yet 55 years old, but his contemporaries described him as a frail old man, stooped, with trembling hands, nearly bald, and with a lifeless gaze. Illnesses, presumably severe arthritis, and, according to some accounts, syphilis, had reduced the once stately sovereign to a wreck. In November 1581, an event occurred that became, perhaps, the most terrifying symbol of his reign. In a fit of rage, according to various accounts, triggered either by his pregnant daughter, in-law's clothing, or a political dispute, Ivan struck his eldest son and heir, Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich, with his staff. The blow proved fatal. A few days later, the Tsarevich died. For Western readers, an explanation is necessary. This scene is known throughout the world thanks to Ilya Repin's famous painting, Ivan the Terrible Kills His Son, 1885. The painting so shocked contemporaries that one viewer slashed it with a knife in 1913. Today it is housed in the Tretiakov Gallery in Moscow. Historians still debate the details, whether the blow was intentional or whether it was indeed the cause of death. But the very fact of the prince's death under circumstances linked to his father is beyond doubt. Ivan killed his son, the very same Ivan Ivanovich whom Anastasia had borne him. The boy whose birth in 1554 had been one of the greatest joys of his life. The heir to whom he had sworn before his dying wife to pass on his great kingdom. It is said that after killing his son, Ivan wept over his body just as he had once wept over Anastasia's. But tears are poor atonement. For the state, it was a catastrophe. The only remaining heir was his second son, Fyodor, a meek, devout man clearly not destined to rule such a vast country. Contemporaries described Fyodor as mentally limited, almost a holy fool. He spent his days in prayer and the ringing of bells, leaving the governance of the state in the hands of the boyars. Strangely enough, the shadow of Anastasia came to life in him, the same gentleness, the same piety, the same inability to be cruel. But now these qualities were not a pillar of the throne, but its weakness. On March 18, 1584, Ivan the Terrible died. The circumstances of his death also raise questions. He died suddenly while playing chess. According to some accounts, traces of mercury and arsenic were also found in his remains in concentrations exceeding normal levels. If this is true, then the history of poisonings at the Moscow court takes on an almost geometric completeness. Poison may have killed his wife, and poison may have killed him as well. The poisoner became a victim of the poisoners. Before his death, Ivan took monastic vows under the name Ion, an ancient Russian custom that allowed the dying to enter the next world purified. Taking monastic vows before death was widespread in Orthodox Russia. It was believed that monastic vows washed away the sins of worldly life. For a man with thousands of deaths on his conscience, this was his last chance at forgiveness. He was buried in the Archangel Cathedral of the Moscow Kremlin, where all the Moscow Tsars rest. His grave lies right next to that of his son Ivan, whom he had killed. He outlived Anastasia by 24 years. 24 years without her, and each of those years was darker than the one before. The time of troubles ended in 1613. It ended in the way that Russian crises often end, not with a decisive military victory or a philosophical resolution, but with exhaustion. The country had simply run out of capacity for further destruction. The foreign armies were expelled, not triumphantly, but because they too had grown weary of a war that offered diminishing returns. The pretenders had exhausted their credibility. The great boyar families had exhausted each other. What Russia needed was a Tsar, not a capable Tsar necessarily, not a brilliant administrator or a military genius, just someone who could stand at the center of the political system and provide the legitimacy around which everything else could organize itself. The Zemsky Sobor, that representative assembly that Ivan had created during the good years of his reign, during the years when Anastasia was alive, convened in Moscow to make a choice. They had a list of candidates. Foreign princes were considered, and rejected Russia had had enough of foreigners. Various Russian noble families put forward their claims, argued over precedents, and exhausted themselves in dispute, and then someone put forward the name of a 16-year-old boy who was living in a monastery with his mother, having no particular experience of governance, no military record, no personal distinction of any kind. His name was Mikhail Fyodorovich Romanov. He was the son of the Metropolitan, later Patriarch, Filaret, who was at that moment a prisoner in Poland. His mother was Ksenia Shestova, a noblewoman who had been forcibly tonsured during the time of troubles and taken the religious name Marfa. Why Mikhail? The arguments made at the Zemsky Sobor were several. He was young, manageable. His family had not been deeply involved in the worst of the time of troubles intrigues. They were relatively clean. And crucially, the Romanovs had a blood connection to the old dynasty. That blood connection ran through Anastasia. Mikhail Fyodorovich Romanov was the great-grand-nephew of Anastasia Romanovna. His grandfather, Nikita Romanovich Zakharin, had been Anastasia's brother. Through that line, through the family of the first Tsarina, the new dynasty claimed its legitimacy. The Zemsky Sobor chose him. On the 21st of February 1613, Mikhail Romanov was elected Tsar of Russia. He was reluctant to accept. His mother was reportedly even more reluctant. She had seen what the Russian throne did to people, and she did not want it for her son. But the delegation that came to the Ipetiv monastery in Kostroma to offer him the crown made clear that there was no alternative. Russia needed a Tsar. Mikhail was the Tsar. He accepted. The Romanov dynasty would rule Russia for the next 304 years. until the last Romanov, Nicholas II, abdicated in March 1917 and was shot by Bolsheviks in a basement in Yekaterinburg in July 1918, 304 years. The largest empire on earth, from the frozen tundra of Siberia to the borders of Prussia, from the Arctic to Central Asia, ruled by descendants of the family of Anastasia Romanovna, the woman who had come to Moscow as a modest gentry girl for a bride, who had spent 13 years trying to hold a brilliant and broken man together, and who had been murdered, probably, for precisely that reason. History has a sense of irony that no novelist would dare to invent. Anastasia Romanovna left no memoirs. She did not write letters, at least none of them have survived. We do not know what she thought about at night as she lay beside a man capable of monstrous cruelty. We do not know whether she feared him, loved him without fear, or was able to do both at the same time. We do not know at what moment she sensed she was dying, or whether she realized she was being killed. We know only the result. 13 years of peace in a country that had been plunging into chaos before her reign and drowned in blood afterward. The code of laws, the Streltsy army, the capture of Kazan, the opening of a trade route to England via the White Sea, all of this happened during her reign and, in part, thanks to her. Not because she wrote laws or commanded armies, but because there was one particular person by her side who was capable of thinking about the future rather than just revenge and fear. And the 3 centuries of a dynasty that ruled 1/6 of the landmass, that, too, is her legacy. That's quite an achievement for a woman whom history long regarded simply as the tyrant's first wife. If this story has captivated you and you'd like to learn more, where to find traces of Anastasia today, if you find yourself in Moscow, the Kremlin is open to visitors. Russian Tsars are buried in the Archangel Cathedral, and in its crypt lie the Tsarinas, including Anastasia. The armory houses items of personal embroidery from her workshop, some of the finest examples of this art in the world. Kolomenskoye, now a museum reserved within Moscow, is the very place where she died. The Church of the Ascension still stands there today. The famous painting Ilya Repin, Ivan the Terrible and his son Ivan on November 16, 1885, is housed in the Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow. This is not a documentary depiction, but a 19th century artistic interpretation, yet it conveys better than any words what Ivan became after Anastasia's death. For those interested in serious historiography, among Western scholars, Robert O. Crummy is considered the most authoritative. His works on the history of the 16th century Muscovite state have been translated into many languages. Isabel de Madariaga wrote a detailed biography of Ivan the Terrible in English Ivan the Terrible, First Tsar of Russia, 2005, in which she devotes considerable attention to Anastasia's role. Among Russian historians, the works of Ruslan Skrinnikov, the most detailed biographer of Ivan IV in Soviet and post-Soviet historiography, are considered classics. You can read about the study of Anastasia's remains in the publications of Tatyana Panova, a number of which are available in open access.